This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube and wish to listen to this program as a podcast, you may click the link below to your favorite podcast platform. This talk is with Peggy O'Brien, Director of Education at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. In the 1980s, Peggy pioneered the establishment of the library's educational programs and then moved on to other management positions in education-based concerns, including her role as Senior Vice President of Education Programming and Services for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. She returned to the Folger in 2013, where, with her team, she has continued to develop better ways for students to encounter Shakespeare through a process or arc of learning called the Folger Method. This series is funded with institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Hello, Peggy. Good afternoon to you. It's my good morning is your good afternoon. We are so delighted to have you here. I wanted to start out by making a couple of points here. Without the K-12 teaching of Shakespeare across the globe, Shakespeare could almost be lost to public consciousness or of a far, far lesser presence in the public mind. To power an institution as large as the Folger and its world-class holdings and its programs over time, to do this, you have to engage children, teenagers, people in schools. To not do that would be like trying to power a car without gas or electricity, and perhaps without even major component parts of the engine. So I think the Folger's great success in the past decades is due to its understanding of the importance of retaining the superb team of educators, a team that you head up, one that has been ceaselessly inventive over the years in providing on-site programs, and in more recent years, abundant online tools and resources to help teachers adopt a student-centered approach to the learning of Shakespeare proper, a process that also more broadly cultivates self-expression, self-confidence, critical thinking skills, and one that, when things work, inspires young people throughout their lives on whatever path they choose. Now, this process at the Folger is called the Folger Method, and may we ask you to explain to us what the Folger Method is?
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you having a conversation about this. Thanks for saying all those lovely things about the Folger's education work. The Folger Method is simply a way of teaching. It started out as a way of teaching Shakespeare. Now we know that lots of teachers who know this method use it to teach, and I'm talking about middle school and high school more in the US. But they use it to teach other kinds of complex literature, what we call complex text in our universe. It's a way of teaching that starts with the language. If you talk to folks and you say to teachers or you say to kids, what's the hardest thing? And they say, oh, it's the language. And kids say, why didn't we write in English, for heaven's sake? I mean, why do we, this is hard. And what we know and what we've learned is that you start right with the language and you get the language in students' mouths. And we teach teachers how to do this, how to teach this way. You get the language in kids' mouths, and that starts to break down a lot of assumptions or fear that they're not going to understand it, that he only uses words that are really complicated, that it's never going to be accessible. And then that quickly leads to, why do I have to learn this anyway? But if you can start making sense of it yourself, then you see, ooh, there's some juicy stuff in there to get us thinking about. And I should just say that the Folger Method started. So I taught high school English in a District of Columbia public high school, 2 District of Columbia public high schools, Washington, D.C. And what has become the Folger Method started in my classroom. And I was a second-year teacher. I had a class of really, really bright students. And we had these ancient anthologies, these big fat books, and British literature. British literature still in many schools is the 12th grade English curriculum. And in this anthology was Macbeth. And I said to them, I was probably 23 years old. And I said to them, we could read Macbeth or we could read the big one. And they said, what's the big one? And I said, Hamlet, which at the time I thought was the big one. I don't think I do anymore. But and so we had to have some bake sales and raise some money and buy books. And we started on Hamlet. And these kids were completely motivated. They were also great readers. There were no barriers, really, none of the usual barriers. And we started to read the first scene in Hamlet. And I was teaching it as I was taught it in high school. We read up and down the rows, your Bernardo, your Marcellus, all that. Mm-hmm. And about partway through that, and that's a really great first scene also, as opposed to some other Shakespeare plays. And so about halfway through, I said, okay, so what do you think? And they said, what is this? This is terrible. And I thought, oh, dang. And so, and really, these were really motivated students. So 17, 18 years old. And so I said, really? And they said, what? They also said some other more colorful language, but I'm going to leave that out. Yeah. And so I thought, and that's when I really learned what the role of a teacher is. Like, I was the piece that was between them, their eagerness and their motivation, and a text that they could really learn something juicy from. And that's a great story, right? So I said, well, it's Friday, so I'll have something better about this on Monday. And I was really at my wit's end. I knew nothing about theater, nothing about drama, I mean, I know a little bit more now, but not my field. I was an English major, liberal arts college. But I thought, well, he wrote plays, and he knew what he was doing, writing plays. And so let's start there. So I chunked up Hamlet into scenes, and it made all the difference. And then some years later, I ended up almost by accident at the Folger Shakespeare Library, where there was no education department. But once we started to do education work there, I started to continue the development of all that with the help of some wonderful scholars and some terrific actors. It's based on a set of principles that make a lot of sense. It captures the interest and the engagement of kids of all ability levels. And especially now, because we're in a changed world, is the idea of giving up Shakespeare worship. Get him off the pedestal and get him talking to other writers. Or other writers of different genders and centuries and all that. So it's a much more interesting way to teach. And the teacher's the architect, and the students are making their own connections with the language. And that makes all the difference. So that's in a nutshell what it is.
Yeah. And there's so many inventive ways that the Folger has laid out lesson plans. You also, in these programs, you do professional development. I spoke years ago for a group of teachers who were on an NEH-sponsored program that you had set up. There's also what's called the Wide World that I like a lot, because there's a global theme to this series, and not just American, not just UK, a theme that goes across the world. And then there's live Folger teaching. Those are 4 things that are featured on your website, but quite a lot that's offered on site and also virtually.
Yes. Our education programs were mainly in person. We had a few things on the Folger website, but not a lot. And this was pre-COVID. We heard from a lot of teachers, we don't want to wait for a workshop. We would do workshops around the country, and actually perhaps we will resume doing workshops around the country, but they said, we don't want to wait for a workshop necessarily. And so where can we get information from you all and get teaching plans and get some scholarship information and so forth? And so we started to put this website together. We had a lot of input from working teachers. We feel like we really do know that people who teach K-12, and most of the Shakespeare that happens in that zone is middle school and high school. So that's like 6th grade through 12th grade. Teachers who teach those grades, we know, do the most important work on earth. And that goes back to how you started, Tom, is lots of students wouldn't be in college classes if they hadn't had a chance to fall in love with literature. or fall in love with whatever they were studying in middle school or in high school. It has a huge impact. So our job is to serve those teachers. And we also find ourselves serving a lot of college professors too, because they're interested in the how of teaching. But we think they're really important. So, but mainly our programs were, we would bring in, they were in person, we would bring in teachers from around the country. That our NEH Teaching Shakespeare Institute is NEH funded, and that's what you mentioned, Tom. Lots of programs with local teachers and students as well. But as I say, even before COVID, we began to realize that we should put a lot more stuff online. And so we also started we have a membership for teachers. I think we're the only rare book library that has a teacher membership. And so all of that's online is accessible. And it's a website called Folger Teaching, specifically for teachers, teaching.folger.edu. And so all of that is there and has been there. What we learned through COVID so COVID hits, and in March 2020, schools start to shut down. Almost all schools in the United States became virtual. And well beyond the United States became virtual. And so we said to teachers, we have these regular kind of chat meetings on the last Wednesday of every month. And the last Wednesday of March, after school shut down, 150 teachers showed up for this chat. And we said, what can we do? And they said, you can have meetings like this every week. We said, every week? They said, every week, and make them longer. I've never heard a teacher ever say, make this meeting longer, and give us some things that we can do online. And we knew we had some of that stuff in our arsenal. But in some ways it was like, if you've ever taught a class and you felt like you were one page ahead of the students, it was a little bit like that. But they were all on Zoom, and we had teachers up and shouting Shakespeare lines at each other and working all this stuff. And it proved to be very, very helpful to them. We also, the Folger library released at no cost audio versions of, I think we have 6 or 7 plays that our actors, when they came to work on the stage, they also recorded audio versions. We released those at no cost. Also, we have a video of a really wonderful production of Macbeth that teachers really like. We also released that for no cost. And I was one of the people who talked to great performances at PBS and said, please, can you put outside a paywall the Public Theater's production of Much Ado About Nothing, which is with an all African-American cast. And so we put some resources together, but we also learned for ourselves that you could really do some good teaching online, and that teachers really appreciated it, and they used the stuff that we had. So that also then led us to expand all the offerings that we have on that website. In addition to that, we also know, we've learned through our work since the very beginning, that teachers, if you are teaching in a middle school or a high school, the time that you have to investigate scholarship is practically zero, because you are teaching and then you're going home with a book bag full of papers to correct and all that stuff, or your laptop with all those papers on your laptop. And so the idea of scholars giving teachers new ways to look at old plays, new perspectives. And also in the United States, often you teach the same play every year. If you teach 9th grade, it's pretty sure that Romeo is on your menu. And so the idea of new perspectives on these plays is so welcome. And so we also have a continuing series of those kinds of things as part of our professional development.
Yeah, this is great. And I may want to return to the challenges of pandemic. And of course, we will talk a little bit later about the Folger, recent renovations at the Folger. But I wanted to make I think it's a salient point. When in the UK, I'm certain in other, Australia, New Zealand, whatever, other English, first language English cultures, North America, Shakespeare is very ubiquitous in middle and high school. In Japan, where I am now, literature is not taught in high school. There's no literary education, and there's a lot of Shakespeare, and there's a troupe that just we thought had dissolved but came back up, Shakespeare for Children, and they do some pretty exquisite stuff. Now it's cut down a bit and it's in Japanese, But the thing is, on the college level where I am, these strategies that you're offering to middle and high school teachers are fully transferable. Uh, I think, I mean, a second language situation, we have excellent English speakers, but everybody is in a second language situation when they first approach Shakespeare.
Well
They
said, well
first get
said. Yeah,
dropped in medias res in the first act of Hamlet, where you're expected to catch up because something's already been going on. There's a dead king before the play even starts. There's
right.
some noise and drum beats coming from the north. There's a ghost out there, and you have to catch up. And it's so hard if you don't see a stage production to envision that from the text. And I think that's what you're talking about. You have to get that into it. But if you just say to the kids, go home and start reading, they won't make it
No,
through a page. I don't think I did in high school. And I do
right.
remember in high school, some people have had stories, in our generation, have some terrible stories about being taught Shakespeare. I actually had a couple of very engaging teachers, one of whom, and this is low tech, but there was a vinyl record, King Lear. And, he would ask us to read parts and so forth, but we could hear professional actors reciting lines, and that worked, right there in class. And of course, all the boys in class loved the scene with Kent cursing Oswald. I think we all
Oh,
memorized
that's
that
great.
scene.
Oh, I love
What,
that.
what a portal! You talk about portals, but there's something there for everybody, women, men, young, old, whatever. There's something there for everyone.
Yes, I love, and that's funny. I love that. That speech is a big favorite. Um, and I think, for us students speaking the words, what we say to teachers all the time is it's about the process. It's about getting those words in kids' mouths, and then that helps to get ideas into their heads. And so in terms of learning, I mean, we think a lot about how people learn, and people learn in very different ways, obviously, but we would much rather have a student saying those words than to have their first pass at those words listening to somebody else. Not that that recordings and audio tapes are not important. I also think they are especially important. I've always thought they were especially important if they were done with actors who are using their own accents, with actors who are not in that, whatever that's called, that mid-Atlantic English that actors are supposed to speak Shakespeare in. I don't know whose idea that was. But speaking Shakespeare in the accent that they use in their family or that they have at home or how they speak generally, then that also sends a very clear message that Shakespeare is for everybody, and Shakespeare is for everybody. And we want students to bring their whole selves to this work, including their own culture and how it all translates in their culture. So yeah, it's exciting.
Well, what is you are attuned? What is typical for middle school? What would be the play choices in a typical middle school?
So Shakespeare in the US is taught less in middle school than in high school. Though in high schools now, people are really questioning, should we be teaching Shakespeare? Should we teach as much Shakespeare? In middle school, often the play is Midsummer Night's Dream.
That's
for,
what I
for
thought.
reasons
Yeah.
that are kind of obvious. Of course, there's a whole dark side to Midsummer. A total dark side.
I'm going, whoa! Some
Right.
of this. Yeah.
But the dark side is not traveling in middle school. In middle school, it's all on the upside. And so for kids first, for a first take at some of this stuff, lots of schools do that. Also, there are some terrific teachers who cut Macbeth. Macbeth is also kind of a fave in like around 6th grade, kids who are 12.
Macbeth.
Yeah.
For
yeah,
12-year-olds.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously cut. I mean, no language modernized. The whole No Fear Shakespeare, I have a lot to, actually I don't have a lot to say about that, except that it's, it's supposedly modernized text. And it is, I say to teachers all the time, it is created by people who do not think your students are smart enough to get the real thing, and they don't think you're smart enough to teach it. And neither of those things is true. But yeah, the idea of cutting, using the text that we have, as far as we know what Shakespeare wrote, and then having cut scenes from Macbeth or cut scenes from something else, that's really useful for students, especially if they're starting out.
Yeah, well, talk about dark themes, but then again, I don't think there's any literature out there worth its salt, even comic literature, even lighter literature, that doesn't have that sort of thing. That's what you want students to experience, vicariously, to go through. And you just talk to people over and over again who, a book that they liked in those years, those formative years. And, someone, who says, well, we shouldn't teach Shakespeare at all. Well, who else? What else? And I spoke recently with James Shapiro, who just wrote on Shakespeare in America.
Right.
And we get the question a lot over here. And I'll just repeat what I said there, and what he agrees with too, is that it was the foundational principles were people who wrote those, who established that, who unified the country, were primarily subjects of the crown before the revolution, and had been subjects of the crown for generations in some cases. And Shakespeare was just national literature in a way, even though they're colonials. So for a long time, Shakespeare had been in America. Of course, the King James Bible, Milton, those things. So it was already Americanized before there was America. And so it's not like, we suddenly were a nation that was 100 years old, and a bunch of teachers said, hey, let's go over to another country and get their writer and start teaching it here, because we really don't have our writers. It was already here. It was part of thing. It was part of the consciousness of, John Quincy Adams, of Ulysses S. Grant, and, it was just already here. So I think that's the best argument for retaining Shakespeare in school. And I think there's also an argument for branching out, using Shakespeare as a portal to branch out to other authors on your website that you mentioned, more contemporary authors. But the ones that you mentioned, Shakespeare's tough, but they can be very tough too,
Oh, sure. I mean, one of the questions that teachers are asking now about Shakespeare has to do with the fact that he is a dead white guy, right? And so one basic question is, well, he's a dead white guy and everybody's read him for a million years, so do we have to keep reading him? That's a question. But the other question is how much, my question is to schools, is how much Shakespeare are kids reading, and how many dead white guys? You're a live white guy, so like, no offense, Tom, to you, but like, how many dead white guys?
I'm happy to be on this side of it.
Me too, on your behalf.
As long as possible.
There you go. But how much are they reading? So there are actually some high schools in this country where kids are reading not anything by any author of color, or by anybody who's even alive.
Oh, really? Now.
Now,
I've been out of the States. I've been in Japan this time for 20 years. And I was 5 years before that. So we met actually about 30 years ago.
Right.
Folger. And we were talking exactly about that kind of thing then 30 years ago. And you would think that by now, that even in slow incremental progress towards these goals, these ends, but you're saying that there's progress has been made in places, but not in other places. Some places, not in other places. Right.
Well, schools are, schools are institutions that move slowly, and school districts and school systems, and of course now in the United States, there's the whole critical race theory conversation. School boards are all talking about whether people should teach race, which is kind of a different thing. But things move very slowly. But people have become, and this is before, has been a real racial reckoning since the death of George Floyd. But even before that, teachers were starting to say, wait a second, what are our students? Our students are not reading things that they should read. And so now, for example, many kids will read Beloved by Toni Morrison.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there are some schools where they don't read any James Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
Or they don't read, they read some poets, but not many poets of color. They don't read Frederick Douglass. You should read Frederick Douglass, who was a big fan of Shakespeare, by the way, we know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
anyway, but there's a sweep of literature, and my friend and hero, Dr. Jocelyn Chadwick, talks about the sweep of literature and how students should have access to all of that, so they can get a sense about what they like and who they read and all that stuff. So the questions that are being asked by English departments in the States now, I think are exactly the right questions.
Mm-hmm.
You always want to stop at some point midstream and say, okay, are we doing the best kind of job we can do? And then, so that's important to us, I think, and we are totally encouraged. The Folger is totally encouraging of that. And then also the how of teaching Shakespeare. So you can use some of the things that are going on in these plays to bring up very interesting and contemporary conversations about gender, about race, about power, about transformation, all the kinds of things that are juicy and important in life. Professor Ian Smith from Lafayette College in Pennsylvania in the US is really one of our favorite people. And he talks about the then and there and the here and now. Mm-hmm. And so these plays were written then and there, but we are looking at them, our contemporary selves, our contemporary students are looking at them here and now. And so because when we teach it, we don't want to turn the crank and take kids back in time. Mm-hmm. Entirely. We want them to be able to see we want them to be able to discover how these sit with them in the world that they live in now. And that's exciting. I mean, that's a wonderful way to teach.
Yeah. Well, let's probe into this a little bit. The recent kind of I read news in Tokyo. And so I spoke with a friend of mine who lives in Charleston, South Carolina recently. And I said, what's the thing with masks? Like if you have a mask on, is someone yelling at you on the street? And if you don't have a mask on, somebody is yelling at you, get yelled at no matter what you do. He goes, no, it's not like that. I said, but looking at the news stories, it looks like there's some angry person in Texas or someone in New York City angry, yelling at somebody across the street. So when the critical race theory comes through via various media, of course, now I think there was a recent election in Virginia where that was the pivotal thing. Yes. And parents were very upset. And a reporter, Matt Taibbi, went and talked to people, and it was really not about that. It was about something else having to do with parents feeling that their children weren't getting prepared for college. And these were, right. So that's a very complicated thing. And I just encourage people to read up on that. But I think that there's an interesting thing going on now with social media where there's a knee-jerk reaction, and it's coming from a lot of directions, not just, let's say, white conservatives who don't want their children to learn how bad they are being white, right? Which is part of the narrative. There's also, I read in New Mexico, where they're dealing with this in schools, an effort to teach race in a way that can be expanded throughout the country. But some families from Latin backgrounds are saying, listen, I don't want my 7-year-old kid to think of us and our family because of our background, because we're bilingual and we have this heritage, to think that we're victims. We're not victims. We're hardworking people. We're Americans, And so they're getting pushbacks from there in New Mexico. And I've, in certain Black intellectual circles too, there's some pushback about the way in which things might be taught. But I truly, truly believe that what is not happening is that people are not going in and talking to teachers, and that parents and teachers are not communicating enough. I'm sure they are a lot, but not enough. And I think that everybody will settle down if you that direct line between parents and teachers. And my children never had a teacher who said, no, I'm not going to talk to you, Tom, about what we do in school. It was always, please come in and get involved. Parental support, that's so much of everything. And as a teacher, if a parent, now in college you don't have this as much, but just keeping the lines open, letting people, transparency, this is what we do, this is what has worked. Sometimes we fail. So, give us your input. But you don't have to take a bunch of people and charge into a school board meeting because people on the school board aren't teaching those kids day to day. They're developing policy and so forth. So I don't know, is that a possible solution, just to encourage more parent and teacher interaction and communication?
It could, I think it could be. I do think there's a floating reality that if you are in K-12 education is something that you see all the time. And that is, there are lots of people who really feel that they're experts in education because they went to school. And,
Yeah.
and I don't mean that, I'm saying that perfectly seriously, right? People went to school, they had a good experience in school, they had whatever kind of experience they had, they went to school, so they know about it. And so there are a lot of people, not just parents, but a lot of people who feel that they are experts and they just know the how and everything. So that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that now everything in the United States is so charged up. It's so politically charged. The Folger is 3 blocks from the US Capitol.
Yeah.
And so we are more aware than most institutions. Well, we're right across from the Supreme Court. We're diagonally kitty corner from the Supreme Court and across one street from the Library of Congress. So on January 6, 2021, it was all happening, and actually I live not very far from the Folger. So if you were trying to, think that maybe the country wasn't as polarized as it appeared, it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't think we're doing a very good job listening to each other.
Mm-hmm.
For long years, kids who read certain things in English class. English class is what I know about the best, right? So kids who read things in English class, there were parents, and I cannot think of a good example now. And when we're finished, I will think of 100 good examples. But there would be a book that a parent would object to. Mm-hmm. on maybe religious grounds, or they would have an objection, and that was fine. And so there was always an alternative text. Teachers have been doing this for decades, right? There was always an alternative text that the student, there was no judgment, there was no hierarchical thing about you're not reading the real book or any of that. Schools have done that forever. Teachers have done that forever, because there's respect for having a different opinion, right? And thinking this does not fit in my idea. So, and that seems perfectly right? Now, I think what we're talking about is, parents feeling, some groups of parents feeling like they can set the curriculum. They know what their children ought to read, and they know what they don't want them to read. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the other thing is, if you teach, I feel like no matter what you teach, what you're really interested in is truth. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of not, and there are degrees, and there are certainly conversations about when, like the 7-year-olds, do you need to lay the whole thing out to the 7-year-olds? No. But the idea of, for example, teaching American history and in high school, which that's required of in every state, that a kid takes a year of American history, mm-hmm. US history, and to not teach about the Tulsa massacre, to just not teach it, that's not the truth. That's not. So there's a rational middle, I think, in all that, but we're not there yet. And the other thing is, I think it's so political in the US now. School boards are elected, and people who are on school boards, except for the ones now who are running for the exits, they want to be reelected. They want to keep their jobs. And so it's a confluence of a lot of crazy stuff, I think.
Yeah, well, I think you make the point that it's always been like this. We've always had these points of conflict, and probably in the past better managed in most cases
Yeah.
than now. And we can go and blame social media. How long do we have to blame social media? Just get used to it. People got used to the radio. People got used to television. There was a lot of hysteria around radio when it first came out. I think some people blamed the third radio for the Third Reich. But the thing is, and television was going to turn us all into couch potatoes, and I think it probably turned some people into couch potatoes. But we lived through that. We got through that, and it's time to get through this. And I think that I'm seeing the beginning of a kind of awareness. Okay, a society educates itself, and when people, the pandemic did not help because you're isolated. You're not talking to your neighbor on the street and getting your bearings straight. You're
Right.
in this virtual world, and people are screaming out, and they're saying and doing things that they would never do if they were sitting in front of a person face to face in a meeting, or so there's been a lot of bad behavior. But I do think that we'll probably adapt, and that the conversation will continue. I'd like to be optimistic about it, but I don't see, of course, people running in and screaming about socialist Marxists trying to turn our country into whatever, the Soviet Union. I don't see any that would be helping anything. And I also, on the side that I'm usually, I'm an academic, to be haughty, to seem to others as if you're looking down your nose at them, and that doesn't help either, or to call them stupid, or to do that sort of thing. It just adds fuel to the fire. And I found that when they get settled down and look at things closely, then you get a much more chance for consensus, and at least people can agree to disagree and get on with their lives and so forth.
Yeah, I would say also, just as a little coda to that about teachers and about the pandemic, is in the beginning when schools shut down in the US in March 2020, most schools shut down and they went virtual.
Yeah.
Almost all schools did. And teachers had to really scramble to figure out how to make that work. And lots of teachers, lots of really terrific experienced teachers said, I feel like I'm a first year teacher, because I'm learning how to do this on Zoom, or I'm learning how to do this, technology. But they did it. And when kids started learning at home, parents, there was this huge groundswell of appreciation for teachers. It's like, oh my God, we get it. Even those who didn't get it before, your jobs are so hard. We are so admiring of you. But that has dissipated. And then, I do think the worst job in the world to have in the United States right now is to be the superintendent of a school district, because you cannot win. And because we just don't know. We're so, in order to protect people, we're trying to deal with all kinds of stuff. But teachers now have been, that was a great groundswell of recognition for teachers. But since then, it has gone downhill pretty fast. And this school year that we're in the middle of feels way worse to teachers than last year. Partly because they thought it was going to be better. We all did. And partly because their tanks are on empty, and this reflects on something that you said, Tom, is teachers, like everybody else, they are worried about the health of their kids. They're worried about the health of their parents and their grandparents. They're worried about everything, and they're also taking care of a lot of people. So everybody's out of gas, I think, in some way.
Yeah, of course. And
so respect and listening and respect, they come hard by when you're out of gas.
We're just out of gas. Yeah, there's just no energy for that. We just have to hope that we get on, that we surface out of this, that the kids can get back into school and stay there. And I just hope that's the case. And I think once that happens, once the real world comes back into play and is consistent, and the teachers are get some of their gas back, refuel a bit,
Sure.
and the parents settle down a bit because they're not worried about how the day how the we're going to have to quit our job to take care of our children at home, and those
All
financial
that.
stresses, the stresses of of course sickness and disease and elderly living in the house, all of those stresses subside a bit. I think that the conversation will get a little bit better. And I don't want to be a Pollyanna here, but I just don't. Negatives just filled up.
Right.
It's like no more room to
Yeah.
develop, in that area. There's just too much going on there. It's just not enough more. There's no more space for negative, and so
Well, and one of the things we know from teachers is something that really is appealing to students and that keeps on being appealing to students is literature.
yeah, yeah,
Because, and maybe you're teaching it in a different way, and you're also maybe examining kinds of literature that are not really in the curriculum. I mean, most really good teachers are thinking, okay, I'm going to jettison stuff that isn't going to make sense, and I'm going to really pay attention to things that is going to capture the interest of teachers. And in a lot of cases in English class, that's literature. In a lot of cases, it's Shakespeare, but in a lot of cases, it's all kinds of poetry. It's all kinds of different things. And that allows kids to dive deeply into something and then talk about it and then ask the questions. And so that's all a part of the importance of the humanities, I think, in general.
absolutely. We make it, and we are under attack all the time. And I'm thinking there's some recent, why do we need these people? What good are they doing? And there just seemed to be a group of people, I don't think it's a large group of people, who just don't like the idea of humanities. They think that we are doing something that we're not really doing all the way across the board. You can get one example of one teacher saying one, anecdotal evidence of this or that, but I don't think there's a good, strong understanding of what is the public demand for Shakespeare, for the humanities. There's always been an enormous, and this is regular people in regular jobs. They want this in schools, and they like that their children are learning to read on a higher level or a more profound level. There's just a strong public demand for this. If you go to the other end and say, listen, okay, let's just take it out, there would be a public outcry. What? We're not going to teach literature in school anymore. We're not going to teach Shakespeare in school. And Harvard University says, nope, no more Shakespeare. Does their reputation go up after that or what? Right. And we all know this. And in my classes, I have a lecture class. And one of the problems I've had over the years teaching is that 230 kids will show up for it. And that's too many. I can't use any of these. Folger method is very difficult when you have that many.
For a big crowd.
And so, we go, and fortunately, we have film, we can break things up a bit. And at least we have that and good productions, and we can examine what directors and actors, how they do certain things. So we can do that, but 230 people is too many. But it's because that Shakespeare is such a brand, an item. The kids want it. I think 30% are there because they see it is not much different from Dior or Gucci. And we're in a fashion district in our university. We're very fashionable Methodist. Actually, we were founded by the Methodists, but very fashionable place. And about 30%, I don't know about this, Romeo and Juliet, it starts out with, I thought it was about love, and it starts out with a street fight. But the rest of them are there, and they're always at least 30% who are just tuned in. They just get it, and they want to know more, and they sign up. Now I have a little seminar class also, which is more like in the 12 to 15 student range. And that's where we can do some acting and performance and, presentation kind of things like that, whatever the individual student feels comfortable with. But it's wanted here, and so the question isn't why do you keep Shakespeare in schools, and say, well, what happens when you don't have any Shakespeare in schools? What are you going to get then? And it's not going to be us. You're not going to hear our voices. You're going to hear the voice of a guy who's working as there's a nurse, an attorney here or there, a guy who owns a car dealership, people who are shop owners in your towns. They'll be the ones asking the question, why are we dropping this?
Right. Well, and something that the Folger is learning, you mentioned earlier about the construction that's going on there, where we have been closed to the public
Yeah.
since before the pandemic, since January 2020, and we are adding a lot of gallery space. And we are also reorganizing, reinventing a lot of our programs, for the public. And because our director, Michael Witmore, who was really a visionary, and I think he's a genius. I'm honored to be following him. The idea that the Folger, which for a long time has really, we've had theater performances, we've had lots of programs, but essentially we have been turned inward, and that we need to turn much more outward to the public in terms of our exhibitions and our programs and our theater work, much more work in the community. And we're going to revamp some of our local education programs too. But in anticipation of that, we also are looking for audiences of folks who've never been to the Folger before. And so last winter, we put together a program where we did some focus groups. We did some focus groups with different demographics, all different kinds of people, who most of whom had never been to the Folger, all over DC, all over Washington, DC, some in Maryland, but most of them in Washington. And we anticipated people who had never been to the Folger, we anticipated that we would hear that they would say Shakespeare is a barrier to the fact that we've never been there. It's like, too much, too hard, too not interested, too dull, whatever. And that proved to be not the case at all. People said, I've never heard of you, which says something right there. People says, oh, that building, I thought that we have a very kind of a forbidding looking building that was built in 1932.
Yeah.
And people say, oh, I thought that building was a bank.
It does, yeah.
It looks like a bank, but it's not Shakespeare. And so we said, oh, part of this reconstruction is we're going to have some lawn space. People said, what about jazz on the lawn? We said, yeah, what about it? Let's have it. So Shakespeare was not a barrier at all, and we thought it might be. And there were lots of people who were parents or grandparents in these groups who said, I want to bring my children there. I want to bring my grandkids there. I want them to learn all this stuff. I want them to have all this stuff. So that's just kind of a reflection on, from a different perspective on what you were saying, Tom.
Yeah. Well, I think it's right on time. And I know that at the Bodleian, they have a new wing that opened a few years ago, and they basically opened it. The Western wing, you can go in there, this little coffee shop. There are exhibits, there are displays, there are programs, there are lectures for the public. And it's not just the Oxford scholar or who has a reading card who can go in and see all the rare material. It's a feeling of public space too. And you do feel a part, you become part of it. And even though the Folger is a private institution, but it very much has for a long time wanted to have public outreach. There's a theater in the complex,
right,
in the building, and there's another building right across the street on the theater side that's used for educational programs, I think.
That's some offices. Yeah. The education department, and also now development is in there some, and also the department that runs the theater and our poetry program and stuff. But you hit on something that's really important, is we have had so the Folger is not part of the government, even though we are right in the middle of all these government buildings. It's privately funded. We get some government grants from NEH and so forth, but it's not federal at all. And even though we have had a lot of public programs, I don't know. And part of Michael Witmore's vision is that we need to behave like a public institution, right? We need to start thinking about ourselves. And this has gone on for a few years now as a public institution, and we welcome all kinds of everybody. And we want to get them as close to our programs, as close to the collection. We want to offer them all kinds of interesting experiences, fun, learning, great theater, wonderful poetry, all kinds of stuff, and have a social space. So our great hall, which has been our exhibition space up to now, which is a gigantically big room,
Yeah.
is now going to be a communal space.
Oh, good, good.
And there will be a bar there, actually, a little bit of a cafe, and places for people to meet, for people in the community, like your book club can meet there or whatever. And then the gallery space down below, the new gallery space that we're building, will be wonderful, new, and all up to par in terms of what needs to be physically, how they need to be made, so that the display of these kinds of priceless objects that we have, we don't, we always had to worry about that in the Great Hall, but we won't. So the
Yeah.
idea of throwing the doors open and saying, come in, and what we learned during those focus groups is people were like, yeah, we're really interested in this. Like, keep us posted. Tell us when you reopen. We want to come. We want to see what it's like.
Yeah.
So we're learning a lot.
And are you getting closer now to the grand reopening or whatever it is?
Yes. No, yeah, we are getting closer, though we have had some delays, and those are brought to you by the pandemic.
Yeah.
But we will reopen in 2023 for
Okay.
sure. And that's the anniversary of the printing of the first folio.
That might be right on time. I'm hoping in terms of going, if that's the case, it would almost be a perfect timing with pandemic to close,
We hope so.
In some ways, there's nothing fortuitous about this, but the sadness I felt of the Folger closing down, even though I was very happy about the plans, some of that was lessened by the fact that I couldn't have gone, none of us could have gone there anyway to do any of the
Right.
things that we do there. And
Right.
so there you are. Well, I did want to bring up one more point about the interpretation of Shakespeare, what we know and what perhaps a lot of the public doesn't know, because again, things get into the press and they get spread around, and people are told how I'm using the example a few years back. Peggy, sometimes it feels like it's like a year ago, and you find out it was 7 years ago. You know how that.
Understood.
But there was a hubbub about the tempest in Arizona, I believe, and I brought it up on another conversation, and how it was being used to do post-colonial, and these are critical theorists, and they're telling our children all of these things about how bad they are, and so there was maybe it's just a small group that thought that the Tempest should be, jettisoned. Here and there you get plays and also novels. Mark Twain is a great example where people, even on both sides of whatever issue there might be, don't want that book in there. But it was the Tempest. But again, going back to James Shapiro's work, the Tempest was used by Henry Cabot Lodge as part of his argument against immigration. It was used for brilliantly, in a very conservative way to argue against more immigration into America. And then years later, and it has been picked up by post-colonial theorists. And I think there's been some wonderful work done on the play in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But I do wish there were a way to express to people that I don't know of any example where any of my colleagues, anybody I know in the States who are who are teaching in high school or teaching in college, where they've gone in and told students, anybody, that they're bad people and that they need to. So I don't know where it's coming from.
Well, I think in teaching, you want students to discover things for themselves. You want to give them the tools so they can make some discoveries and ask some questions. And sometimes teachers come to study with us at the Folger in the pre-pandemic days, and they would say, I want to learn the correct interpretation of Hamlet, or the correct interpretation of the Tempest, or you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And we say, well, there is no the correct. And see the people in that reading room, they've been there for a long time, and the Folger would be out of business if there was the right way. So So that's one thing. And also what we want students to do is to dive into that language, do some collaborative work with their classmates, and then come to some conclusions of their own about what they think their interpretation is. So that's one thing that your comment makes me think about. And then the other thing is about the Tempest. So we had 25 teachers from all over the country on Zoom, because that's the only way we could do it, last summer, at an institute that was called Shakespeare and the Making of America. And there were two fabulous resident Shakespeare scholars, and then there was a really wonderful series of visiting scholars who were all historians. And the two plays were The Tempest and Merchant of Venice. And we took a deep dive into all aspects of them. But the thing about, and we also just had a professional development session last night online, and the speaker was Mark Summers, who is the public humanities guy at historic Jamestown, the Jamestown Fort. So the interesting thing to me about Jamestown that I think kids are, or anybody, forget like what somebody thinks it means or how it can be weaponized or whatever. It's like, how did we, so the idea that Jamestown, those little boats came up the James River, as this guy Mark Summer says, with those men dressed in those funny clothes, those white guys dressed in those funny clothes, came up the James River in 1607. Shakespeare was writing plays then. And we also, we don't know, but we think a bunch of men on those boats would have to have been second sons or third sons, and they needed to find a life for themselves. They may well have gone and seen something at the Globe Theater. That's not a crazy thought. No, and we don't think of those things happening at the same time. So then there's the issue of the wreck of the Sea Venture, which is a ship that was on its way to Jamestown, and in 1610, was wrecked and out of action. And the wreck of the Sea Venture was, there were other ships around who saw it. There were witnesses, and so there were written accounts of how the Sea Venture went down, and there also were images. People drew pictures, and then those were made into etchings and so forth. And that was highly publicized in England, in London, because all the people on that ship came from London. And Shakespeare wrote The Tempest in 1611, and that is about an island, right? And it takes place on an island. It takes place on an unknown island. People are coming. There's a huge storm, which is Act 1, Scene 1 of The Tempest. And The Tempest actually has never been my favorite, I have to say, because there's only one woman in it. It's like, oh my Lord, there's all those men talking forever. But anyway, so especially that one guy, that Prospero guy who talks.
He talks Lord, a lot, doesn't he?
A lot. But so there are very, very interesting connections, right? And when you think about some of those connections, it's like, oh my gosh, like what, and sometimes that's very interesting sort of historical context to give to students who would never think of those connections. And then, they're reading the play and they're like, well, what's going on here? And what about Caliban? And what about, Caliban saying, I showed you all the best places of this island, and now I'm locked up. Now I can't. So I don't think anybody has to tell anybody that, but for students to find whatever they find in the literature and come to their own conclusions, which then they can change as those conclusions will morph and adjust as they grow older. But the idea that they have the power to put some of these ideas together. So the idea of a teacher, wherever they are, saying, this is what The Tempest means, it's like, that's not really teaching, at least in my opinion. You're not empowering a student to do anything in that case.
Yeah. And it would, the plays would not have survived even the runs, their popularity on the stage during the 18th, 19th centuries, and then in their introduction to schools in the late 19th century and more early 20th century. They wouldn't have done, if, like you said, if we could just read it and say, okay, this is 2 + 2 = 4. right? If there were not those ambiguities, it would not have stood up against those swings and how, yes, it can be used for whatever this conservative position, it can be used for what we think of a more progressive liberal position. But if there were not these ambiguities, it would not have been survived, and it would be of little meaning to us because there just are those ambiguities that
Right.
that we come away with, and that what I love is that we're not told much about how the plays were staged. We're not
Absolutely.
told much about how to do things in terms of blocking, in terms of wherever somebody's supposed to be. So modern directors and modern actors, and on any level, professional, amateur, in schools and so forth,
Right.
can get in there and can interact creatively with this, let's face it, great poet, dramatic poet, and these great stories and this great material. They can collaborate with this material, and it's very open to that in ways that perhaps a novel is not, or even a poem.
Sure. Oh,
Because of
yeah, absolutely. Or other plays where the playwright gives very, very specific stage directions and directions about how lines should be spoken and all that stuff.
Well, that's the kabuki tradition. The no tradition is very prescribed,
Yeah,
and
right.
it's brilliant. It's excellent. It's something, but you probably would find more Shakespeare in Tokyo than you would know in kabuki, although it does, it is here.
Surely, surely.
Yeah, Shakespeare is very, very popular in Japan, and I've been writing about it recently. And it's on an educational theme. We're talking about how to, and I was working with my graduate student who's Japanese, and she, of course, had Japanese education, and another very bright scholar who she did her work at Waseda, but they know, and they grew up, all the way or part the way in Japan, so they know how they were exposed to Shakespeare, and it comes through. There's a lot of private theater activity, of course, but there's a lot in anime and manga and novels for young adult women primarily. And these people, these creative artists, they're so excellent in these genres, at the upper end, they feel the freedom to do anything they want with Shakespeare, right? And they retain a lot too. They see, they'll see the value of retaining this, but then they'll move it over to like Twelfth Night, move it more to the young 18, 17, 16-year-old woman who likes that gender bending, and they'll push that, and then they'll bring it back into convention at the end, that kind of thing. That's what we're working on. There is that sense of freedom, and I think that we can learn from others, and not just Japanese. I think this sort of thing is happening in all over Asia. I think if you looked into a number of African countries where Shakespeare is taught, that you would see some extraordinary creativity where people don't feel under the same yoke, the burden of being authentic, or of the iconic image of respecting the great bard or whatnot, and we can learn from that too, as well as from the Shakespearean text, from other cultures and countries and how they.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Shakespeare's been adapted by more than any other author, I think, probably.
Yeah.
You could say, across the world.
Yeah. Well, there's so much room for adaptation. Well, I wanted to just finish up and talk a little bit. What I loved in the bullet point of you're excellent, just fine, just such an impressive career, and I love the fact that you're moving onward. What else is there to do? But this is it's good. But the my wife and I talk about retirement and so forth, and I don't want to talk about it because I'm not ready. And I feel like as long as I can be of some kind of help in some way, in some capacity, and doing the things that I'm doing, and I think you feel the same way, as long as we're in, let's do it, because it's so rewarding. We've gotten so lucky.
Right.
But the what I really, really love about your career is that you started in DC schools as a teacher right there. So that's, that's like I guess, and if you wanted to talk to a military historian and you found that he was a frontline infantry person, you would, that brings
That's
us
what that
a
is.
feeling of trust, because just like in what people say about wartime, there's a lot of difference 100 yards after you get behind the front line, right?
Right.
And for people who have not had that experience and had to struggle, it's hard to, when you do you've gone into more of a public relations administrative role. You're now doing both at the Folger, but you carry that experience with you. And so I think I'm just very impressed by that.
I actually have a checkered past. My past is it's a kind of a checkered past, because I started out teaching English, and I mean, I had no people now, especially young people, look at my resume and they say, "Oh, well, this is such an interesting career path." And I said, there was no path planned. Right? I mean, there was no, but I ended up working at the Folger. I was teaching, and then I stopped teaching because I had to take care of my parents who were sick. And then I was pregnant and had a baby. And then I was pregnant and had another baby. And I was about to go back to my teaching job when one of my neighbors said to me, "Oh, the Folger, which is down the street from where I live, the Folger is looking for, not for anybody to do anything about education, but for somebody to work up with their docent program."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, I'd love to get inside that place."
Yeah.
I mean, I've been to plays there, but anyway, so I went there, and I thought that was going to be maybe a 6-month. I said, "I'll do that for 6 months, and then I'll go back to teaching." But when I got there, I started working with the docents, and that was great. And then I also realized that they didn't have any education programs for this guy who you cannot get out of high school in the United States
Mm-hmm.
without reading some of. That's a terrible sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said that to the director, and he said, "Well, Peggy." So I started a lot of the education programs there, and I was there for 13 years. I left because I kind of felt like I was out of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to work I had another sequence of jobs. I've always been fascinated with how people learn,
Mm-hmm.
and how we teach people, how to teach people how to learn. I mean, all that universe, Shakespeare is great fodder for that, for sure. But that's the stuff that really interests me. So I worked for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for a chunk of time, and helped to fund some, I think, pretty wonderful stuff on PBS and some on NPR. And
Yes.
but all about kids learning, shows that would teach kids how to read.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I ended up working on the leadership team of the DC Public School District when we had this new hard charging chancellor. And that I had never, I mean, who would ever, as a teacher, would you ever want to work in central office? No. No. But this was the bleeding edge of school reform. Michelle Rhee was our chancellor. And so I was the chief of public and family engagement, which was when we were closing schools all over the place. I mean, that was a hard job. And I loved it. I loved it. It was really interesting. So I have seen sort of those worlds and the world of learning from a lot of different perspectives, in addition to my own family, right? Kids and grandkids and all that. And I was not in any way, I'd never even thought about going back to the Folger until I ended up meeting Michael Witmore, who by that time had been in the director's job for about a year. Young, really energetic and visionary guy, who not only is a wonderful scholar, but also had a really big idea about the Folger. And I, have such affection for this, for the Folger, and but also a lot of energy for the whole idea of opening it up and bringing in lots more people, and engaging a lot more people, having a lot more people bring stuff to the Folger. So that was kind of a no-brainer. I was really excited to and I am not going to work here forever, right? But I wouldn't miss this, because it's an exhausting but really exciting time that is full of change.
Yeah, and I think I can speak for a lot of teachers out there that we had to learn. I mean, it was a crash course in broadcast techniques and technology, and using new digital tools and that sort of thing. and it was exhausting. It still is, but
Mhm.
people who are younger than I am are going to come out of this with still those capabilities. We are learning how to do things. I don't think my curriculum has ever been as structured and organized. And I was looking and I'm going, my goodness, I thought it was organized until we got online, and then I realized, I'm going to have to be far better here if I'm going to
Right,
carry the
right,
day online. And I'm going, why didn't I do this 25 years ago? My goodness. But I didn't need to, because you were in the room with them, and it was a whole different thing.
right.
And it's improved things. It's improved things. And a lot of people are going to surface from this pandemic improved. A lot of teachers are going to find that they've improved and that they've developed great skills. Uh, and we did it mostly on our own. We had to learn
Yeah.
there wasn't the ability to go to a seminar and get trained. There were some Zoom seminars, but so there's some positivity there, I think. And also, I like that the priority is given. I know that I've worked with the team, the digital team at the Folger for
Uh-huh.
the past 2 or 3 years. We're digitizing some of our rare Bibles here and sharing them on the Folger's Miranda platform
Uh-huh.
as more as a demonstration, but also so people. We had these Bibles that really were not. It wasn't easy to go in and see them. Nobody knew about them, and the people who did had to make appointments, and then
Sure.
that kind of thing. And now they can at least see very high definition images and that sort of thing. But anyhow, so we feel close to the Folger in that way. But I wanted our Japanese audience and also our international audience to know that no matter what, where you're teaching, whether it's in a school, high school, middle school, in a college, that when the Folger does reopen, you're welcome there,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
you can do your research there, but you can also learn a lot about teaching strategies in Shakespeare. Those same
Mhm.
teaching strategies are transferable into other areas of literature very
Yes, definitely.
fluidly. I mean, just immediately transferable. And that if you're a Japanese university professor and want to learn more about what might be the best way to teach Shakespeare in Tokyo or in Kyushu or wherever you are, then you're welcome. And it's not open yet, but it's there, and these programs are there.
They are, and would be most welcome. But also, until then, until we are open, we are online. And we
Yes.
are online with a lot of these kinds of things. And the other thing that I would be so remiss if I didn't mention is just that shakespeare.folger.edu is the website where you can find free and downloadable editions of every Shakespeare play, really
Yes.
beautifully edited and recently edited, as opposed to other online editions of the plays and the sonnets and Shakespeare's other poems. And they are they're lovely just to read. I mean, and they're free to anybody. You can
Yes.
have them. Um,
Yes.
but also they're great. They're also great for teaching, because you can cut up segments and move things around.
That,
And they when the folks at the Folger, the digital team at the Folger, put those together, they said, okay, like, we've got these basic ideas and we're ongoing, but how do we make these useful for teachers? And so they paid attention.
well,
Um,
yeah,
and
I
we
want
know
to.
lots of people use them.
Yes, and there's a wonderful interface there that I
Yeah.
used this past 2 years. I used the Romeo and Juliet, and in Zoom teaching, because we've been in hybrid situations too,
Sure. Yeah.
where I can pull it up on the Zoom share screen, and in some cases, students they have a text, and the text has annotations, but this way the people at home and the people in the classroom we're all on the same
On the same page. Yeah.
page, right?
Mhm.
And that has been extraordinarily helpful that way. And so my thanks to the Folger there. Yeah, and I did want to point out that the digital development at the Folger that's another positive thing, because it prioritizes it and it pushes it, and that's where the world is going. And Peggy, what I want to do is kind of close off now, because I'm keeping you from your supper probably, and here I am,
You're
haven't seen
keeping me
you.
from having to think about cooking it, actually. So it's all good.
Well, there's another good thing too. I've done a lot of. Have you been doing more cooking over the past couple of years?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm the family cook. The two people in our immediate family living together. I'm the cook, and I love it. It's been therapeutic, and I think I've gotten better. But I don't
Yeah,
know.
we all have, I think.
Yeah. So thank you again so much for coming in here and speaking with us about the Folger. And I just wish all of you the best. I hope that I can see you in person soon. I hope that some of my colleagues here in Japan who have gone and visited the Folger can look forward to going back. And we might see you or somebody from the Folger over here at some point. We can't do that kind of thing now, but we do want to consider the Folger friends of Japan and friends of the globe,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
and see a human face at the library. Another, I've talked to several people involved there. Okay, so thank you so much, and
Thank you for the
please.
invitation. This has really been fun and enjoyable. So thank you.